Hey everyone, I'm here with Angela Blocker, and she's a friend of mine and has a lot of missions experience and knowledge. She has a degree in global missions.
Global missions.
From Moody, but not Moody in Chicago, Moody in
Spokane, Washington.
Spokane, Washington. Okay.
Yes.
So you started there studying aviation, missions aviation. Tell me about that.
That's correct. So I originally, when I went off to school, I sent out one college application. And I told my parents that if I didn't get into missionary aviation, that I was going to join the Marines. And by God's grace, and to my parents' great relief, I got accepted into the aviation program at Wave I wanted to.
I had never heard the counter option of join the Marines. I can't picture you as a Marine. No, nothing personal.
No, it's okay. I couldn't either. I think I was just
that's really funny.
Experiencing some teen angst or something.
Okay, fair point.
So, yeah.
So missions aviation, that sounds really cool. What got you interested? That's such a specific area of missions.
So I grew up with my mom always listening to Gateway to Joy, which was Elizabeth Elliot's radio program every morning. And she told a lot about her experiences with Jim Elliot, obviously overseas, and everything that happened with them. And I remember thinking that was the coolest thing in the world, and that I had no exposure to understanding that there were people and cultures who didn't have scripture, they didn't have God's word, and that in order to reach them, you had to fly in these tiny little bush planes in the middle of nowhere down these steep slopes sometimes with very little airstrip to bring the gospel to them. So I was really attracted to that.
That's so interesting. Every time I've talked with people about missions, it's always more in anthropology context where that's their kind of preference. But that's really exciting. I know the Elliots have been used to bring a lot of people into missions. Probably 9/11 is the next big event in that sort of what are the big events that wake people up, which is interesting because we're actually in this series we're talking about mobilization and the challenges of mobilization. And I think, so we've already done one in the Latin context, we've done one in the Asian context. I think every context has its own unique challenges and its own unique benefits of what that particular group has to offer. And so I'd love to chat about all of these things with you.
Sure.
So let's just start with kind of the broad question of what do you see as being challenges for African Americans getting into missions, whether short-term, long-term, doesn't matter. And is there anything in your experience or background that relates to this?
Sure. So growing up, I was exposed to lots of different cultures. I grew up in partially in Hyde Park, and so with the University of Chicago, that brings a lot of diversity. And at the time, I was going to a church that had a little bit more diversity until my dad was called into the pastorate, and so he pastored a small church on the south side of Chicago, and it's very traditional, like what you would think of African American missionary Baptist church, with ushers and with white gloves and organs and not wearing white after Labor Day. And
is that a missionary Baptist style?
There's some things that are consistent across missionary Baptist churches, I think. Anyway, so my church was very big on community outreach and evangelism and discipleship, and so I grew up not knowing any missionaries that looked like me. I didn't see African American missionaries come through my church. I don't think I even saw a missionary come through my church. I think there was an understanding that missions was important. It was just more outside of my community at the time. There was always an understanding that you would, when Scripture says to go out and reach all nations, I think that there's an understanding that you talk to people in your workplace, and you talk to people in your family, and you talk to people in your neighborhoods, and you pray for other cultures and the Christians that are there, but you don't really, the idea of going yourself was something that's pretty foreign.
Okay. So did you ever go for yourself?
I did. So in 2011, I went to India for a summer, and that was met with some challenges. I think, first of all, just leaving the country in general can be, if it's not for vacation, seems like an anomaly almost. But to go and do missions work, like it was, from my church back home, like it was very well received. There were people who were encouraging me to go, but it was seen as something that wasn't the norm. Definitely not the norm. It's something that definitely for short term, it means that you're coming back, and it definitely means that I think that's, I'll just say that. It's understood that if you're going to go, it's going to be short term. But for a lot of the people at my church during that time, they didn't, I gave a presentation to explain kind of about the needs that were need for the gospel in India, and my dad was the pastor at the time, and so this was the way to sort of expose my church to missions as a whole. So there were a lot of questions being asked about, why are you going? What are you hoping to do? And how would you, how can you make an impact if you're only there for a short term? But don't you dare stay longer than a summer? That sort of idea.
Parental concerns.
Yes.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So what were some of those challenges in your experience of, coming into the idea, I guess, to start with, but then kind of following through the process?
I just knew that the Lord was calling me to go, and that's something that I really appreciated from my church. There's an understanding that if the Lord is leading you to do something, you do it regardless, and even if other people don't necessarily understand it, you follow the leading of the Holy Spirit. And so, so I felt very, very strongly that the Lord was leading me to go, and I went with the IMB, International Mission Board, and I didn't know my team members, and I was the only African American on the team, and I remember going back to my home church and saying, this is what I'm going to do, and raising support was difficult because in my church there was a lot of poverty, and so people taking care of basic needs was the priority of the time. And so they always gave what they could, and that was helpful. But the majority of my support came from other pastors and families from other Caucasian churches who heard that I wanted to go, and they supported me most of the way, majority of the way.
Interesting. If you could go back and tell younger Angela, one or two things of encouragement, or here's what you need to be aware of, what would that be?
I would say to understand that others are watching you, and sometimes you don't always realize it. So I came back, and there were a group of girls at my church, and they didn't understand it. They just thought that it was this frivolous kind of trip that I was going on, and that, I don't know, that it really stirred up a passion in them to learn more about other cultures and learning how to share their faith, not just in their school context or their with their friends and their neighbors, but also beyond. True missions is beyond the borders of your home country. So I would say that, and also to recognize that the Lord, you never know how the Lord is going to move. So one of my supporters at the time was another pastor, African American pastor, who had not gone overseas to do missions at all. And I remember him saying, "You know what? I want you to go, and I want you to bring me back something." And so I brought him back this book sharing about the history of Calcutta, and he was like, now I'm gonna tell my church that missions is very important. That it seems to close the gap between this is something that is not possible for African Americans to this is a reality that can happen.
Yeah. Interesting. So that was kind of just your own experience, but what would you say are social or cultural factors that are barriers or obstacles or challenges coming from an African American church trying to go over on mission? What do you think those are?
So I think one of the greatest challenges is just access. Yeah, I think access, because
access to
even knowing how to like the practical sides of missions, and even understanding missiology, like history of missions, that's not something that's necessarily taught. I think like going back to my personal experience, like I remember a time when I was in like, I don't know, I was like 7 or 8, and I met Elizabeth Elliot. Did I tell you I met Elizabeth Elliot?
You met Elizabeth Elliot?
Yes, I did.
There.
Yeah, so.
Now I have some of that.
Yeah,
Next we'll talk about animism and how to do it, apparently.
Yes, I met Elizabeth Elliot oh, that's hilarious. When I was like, I don't know, I must have been like 8 or 9 years old or something, and like, all I knew is that she spoke on the radio really, and like at that time, but there's not, even though we learn about like, I learned about like J. Hudson Taylor, like Adoniram Judson, like I learned about all of them in college and not beforehand. And so just in the same way that we teach evangelism and discipleship, I think learning about missions is very important. So, and not just, I think that's something that's a place to start. And then also, so that, I guess that's what I mean by access. Like there's not a lot of knowledge of it, and then there's also not a lot of there's not a lot of history that would have allowed for access either. So when I was thinking about this, I was reading an article super randomly on Ruby Bridges, and so Ruby Bridges is like 5 years older than my dad, and so she's the first African American to like desegregate schools, and so like I'm thinking that, okay, this is just 1960, something like this, and so being able to go to a school with somebody who's a different race than you is fairly new. So going across like overseas to a different country seems like, in a lot of ways, that mindset hasn't been fully developed as of yet. And so understanding that that's something that is possible is, I mean, I think that's why we're having this conversation, to show that it's important. And so, so just access to even like going, and then also knowing that when you do go, when you do share the gospel, when you do share about like what the Lord is doing and has done for us, that you'll be heard, because there are African American missionaries. Like this isn't necessarily something that's new. It's not as formalized as maybe like International Mission Board or like AIM, right, or like a lot of the other mission organizations that are out there, but they have, like, there is a history of African Americans going overseas doing missions. So there have been challenges like not being heard, not being respected, not having like resources. Like a lot of the times when that would happen, they would be sponsored by white Caucasian like either slave masters or just other people who are funding their cause. So like being able to actually do it is something that's still fairly new.
Okay, so all of that's really interesting. The thing about access, that seems to be a pretty common theme throughout many of the other episodes, if we can call it, of these interviews that I've done with other people. And I think it's just part of the challenge, is like seeing yourself in missions and what's the doorway in. Because I can say, having gone as a missionary, even being Caucasian, in the SBC with the, like I'm right in the flagship for my demographic, it's still challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to just about knock somebody over to be able to go.
Yeah. And missions isn't really taught across the board very much.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
So we talked about you going. What is, and just kind of how some people saw that as maybe frivolous. You mentioned this is coming from the context in Chicago. and you mentioned poverty as well being a factor. And so to people who are in poverty, whatever that looks like, there's always kind of the emergency of the now, right? If we don't have money now, then all of this stuff is going to turn off. So I think in that context, missions can seem like this very otherworldly, futuristic, like if my house is on fire, why am I going to go leave my house, let it burn down, go somewhere else? So how do you kind of navigate those two worlds? I mean, lots of mission stuff is about navigating two worlds, your home culture and the other, but you're in a place where there's a lot of immediate needs, and now you're off in India for a summer, gallivanting around. Some people probably saw it. Yeah. How do you reconcile that in your mind?
Well, in my mind, I think it's understanding that it's not. I think there's an idea that because you're taking away from something, like that there is scarcity exists, but at the same time with the Lord there's scarcity does not exist. And so for me it was more like I didn't feel like I was like at the time that I was necessarily taking food out of the mouths of like families. I think that may have been a view that's out there, but at the same time, like understanding that the Lord is our provider. Like He's the one who gives everything, right? And He is not. We're never left wanting, right? We never are lacking anything. And so I think we have to look at, what is done for the Lord is what is done for the kingdom is something that's eternal, and that it does not, it's not corruptible, it's not perishable, it's not lost. And so you can't. It's not about monetary value. It's not about like even experiences. Even it's what's being done like for the kingdom. And so once people are more aware of that and they see the connection between the two, I think that they get excited even to see how they are joining what the Lord is already doing. So they understand that they're coming alongside to say like, this is my way of serving the Lord too. This is my way of not just it's a faith walk. It's trusting that like the Lord is going to be there, and He's going to take care, and He's going to lead, and He's going to guide.
So Evelyn mentioned in her interview, she mentioned that when she left, that there are people at her church who said, "Do you hate your family?" And so just from La Familia perspective, what she was viewed in obeying God, this God call that you're talking about, was very countercultural, to the point where even Christians who should get it didn't. My other friend from South Asia, she mentioned how just following the call to follow God on mission was by her community perceived as inherently individualistic, which, coming from an Eastern context, individualism itself is bad. And so in both of these cases, there was kind of a moral or immoral value attributed to them. And I think ultimately they know, okay, we're obeying God, but it's also hard when you think, okay, my community's not just not financially supporting, but doesn't get it. Yeah. Is there an issue like that for you, and how have you kind of reconciled it?
I think mine is geared more towards social justice issues, as if to say that if you're going abroad to maybe, build a well or build a house or to teach English, can't that time be better well spent giving back to your own community or your own like African American context? So like after I want to say like after the turn of the like 20th century, like there was kind of this movement to sort of pour back into like for African Americans to pour back into their own communities, and that has continued and extended. And I think that that's true even in like a faith context. I think there's an understanding that the church inherently is there to the church provides for its own. I'm saying this very loosely, but there's a therapeutic context of the African American church it's a place of refuge. And so a lot of the times, a lot of the energy that is expelled is towards that. And so I think it's understanding that it's not mutually exclusive. Like, you can't not do one thing and not do the other thing. And so
so you're saying their expectation of you would be that if you went, you'd be doing something related to social justice, or that your mission fervor should be focused locally on social justice?
It's just there's more of a local
okay.
focus.
Interesting.
I don't know. I don't know how like overt that is, but it's definitely an understated sort of. I don't think that it's looked down upon, but I think that in general there's an understanding that it should be like focus your energy on your own community. Focus your yeah.
Yeah. So this whole time we've been having this conversation in the, if there's like an X and Y axis of this conversation, one of those is race. But I don't want to box you into a corner if that's not how you see yourself. So for many people, probably like for your team that you were part of, you were probably their first African American who's worked on that team. I know in the region I was, we had one African American in the entire region. And so outsiders might see you as a thing of, not speciality, what am I thinking of the word? Like exotic, right? There's this kind of exotic mindset, like, oh. And so do you have that sense of, I'm the first African American here? Like, is that part of how you're thinking about these things, or is this more of an individualized thing between you and God?
I see it more of an individualized thing between me and God. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, when I was in India, somebody asked me if I was Rihanna, and that was interesting.
Rihanna?
Rihanna, yes. I may have played it up a bit. I'm just kidding.
You signed some signatures? This could be a funding model.
Oh my God.
Look.
No. No, I just see it as like, the Lord calls you to be obedient, and when He calls, you go. And I think that, I don't know, I think that each, like you said, each group brings like their own flavor, their own unique abilities to missions work. And so I think, and actually when I was in India, I had the opportunity to meet another African American woman who was there also in India. And so that was just the coolest thing. I don't know, I think that because in general, like, African Americans are bent on social justice, I think that that's something that is absolutely needed in other contexts as well. And that's, like, we've even seen historically how, like, when social justice can happen, that, like, people are led to Christ through that. And so, yeah, I think that's a unique gift that African Americans do bring when they are sharing the gospel overseas.
So, since you brought that up, let's just kind of throw that question on the table. Mm-hmm. We're talking about challenges. We also want to talk about kind of benefits and assets. What does the African American community, you mentioned social justice, what else do they bring to bear in playing their role in global missions?
Well, I think historically speaking, we've seen a lot of, the white missionary is what we've seen. And so I think that it's always, like, being African American gives a different perspective. It gives a different missionary. The face of a missionary does not have to look a certain way. And so I think that's something that's very important. And I mean, this is true obviously for like, Vietnamese, like
Koreans,
South Koreans.
Yeah,
exactly.
Group, yeah.
And I think there's an understanding that you don't necessarily have to live a certain way, like for the American dream. I think that's something that's huge. And so, like, becoming a Christian doesn't mean like you have to look like, you don't have to be this type of Christian even too. Like, that you can bring your own, like,
cultural
Lord
identity.
created us all like very, very differently. And so there's a cultural piece that you bring to the culture as well.
Yeah. I think also, with many other communities or many other non-white communities going as missionaries, everybody's got a box for me, right? They already, like, they can see me coming a mile away because I stand out, unless I'm going to Northern Europe. They see me coming a mile away, they already know what they think about us based on politics, movies, former historic actions, et cetera, and so there's already some typically negative box for us, but for Latinos and Asians, Africans,
completely unexpected.
It's unexpected.
The possibilities. Yeah.
In fact, in some places, Jesus is a white American, and that's their perception. And so when someone from Korea, Brazil, some other ethnic group, et cetera, is sharing, I've witnessed this firsthand with a Korean friend in the Middle East, and you can just see the person looking at them going, wait, I thought Jesus was American, right? And yet here's this guy who's from the East, and so that's a fascinating thing. So you mentioned Caucasian churches helping you out, and of course, missions is not about money, but it does take money to do missions. But money historically has also been used to control, whether that's through historic colonialism or more recently some kind of cultural imperialism. Typically, he who has the money makes the rules, regardless of race, color, etc.
Sure.
But when we think of most of the major mission powerhouses in the world, they tend to be not even European-centric, but American-centric, North American-centric. And so thankfully this is actually changing. There are a lot of other global options that are growing. I'm very excited about this, but especially coming from this area, most of our options are dominated by a few kind of usual suspects, big players like IMB, Frontiers, those kind of groups. And there's nothing wrong with that. Praise God that they're there. How do we, without adding to any kind of paternalism, okay, and also recognizing between a lot of white and black churches in the States, there is some historic, especially in the South, a lot of historic bad blood, racism, oppression, other kind of issues. How can we more fruitfully partner and each use kind of our own gifts together without adding to paternalism or any of the other negative side effects? If you just solve that for everybody right now, that'd be
no
fantastic.
Pressure at all.
I'm just gonna drink my tea now. Like practically, where does it start at least?
I feel like I'm giving such a pat answer when I say this, but it is important to education is very important. Talking about in the same way that I remember and my dad introducing the concept of discipleship. So to my church, and discipleship was something that was understood, but not. And it was being practiced, but it didn't have a. It was still new. So biblical education is something that is new, and so in the same way that biblical education has been new for a lot of African American churches, there's also a need for like I said, missions education, knowing about missions, and that missions isn't just the white missionary, but there are so many different cultures of missionaries who have gone out since the first since the apostles, and since the first second generation disciples. Missions has always happened, always happened, and that a lot of people are have a desire to go. They just feel like they can't go for the reasons that we've talked about, and so encouraging efforts. Yeah, just continue to encourage efforts and inviting African Americans to different missions events. Exposure is very important, I think. You're obviously doing this by this conversation. I think I stated that earlier. And just recognize that there's a long history as to why not. I feel like I'm only giving a little bit of little snippets as to kind of what's gotten in the way, but there's a huge desire. Evangelism and community, reaching other communities has always been a part, and so things may look a little different, but there's definitely a desire for it.
I have to give full disclosure. Angela and I go to church together. We go to a multi-ethnic church, and our focus is mobilizing kind of across all categories, not just ethnicities, but to think in terms of socioeconomics and everything else. And we do see this as a discipleship issue, not a kind of privilege issue. Like
right.
People are, if you're called to go, it doesn't matter if you're privileged, you're called to give up your privilege and go.
Right.
If you're not privileged, you're called to kind of go begging, as it were, to ask people for help, because ultimately this belongs to God. And so I've been really excited to see kind of how that's been playing out at our church. This maybe 2 weeks ago, Angela gave a missionary presentation to our kids for Pandita Ramabai. Am I saying that correctly?
Ramabai.
Okay. She was an Indian national missionary to India, and so she dressed up the part and everything. So that was a lot of fun. Okay, so Angela, you've taken this trip and you've come back and you've shared with your church and everything. What is, this was some time ago for you. What have you seen since then?
I've seen African American churches more on a trajectory to send out more missionaries. I think that there's more, like, it is happening in greater, especially now, like here in the South. Like, I think we've seen, we're in the Bible Belt, so I mean, in general, more missionaries come from the South across the board than any other part of the states. But I do see more like African Americans taking mission trips. Actually, my sister took her first mission trip to the Philippines over this past summer, and so that was really exciting.
Awesome
to see. So you see the Lord moving in African American churches, because He's always moved, and I think it's exciting to see what goes.
Yeah. And I know that, like, this is not about race. This is about God's kingdom.
Yeah.
At the same time, I always tell people, you are an ambassador. Like, we know we're an ambassador when we go, but you're also an ambassador coming back this way. Yes. And I think it's really cool. You talked about, like, your friends group that was kind of challenged by what you're doing. Now, we've also had this conversation in the context of global missions and overseas missions. But particularly the city where we live in, 1 in 4 people is foreign born. In our church, we got 50 different nations. In our community, even more so. So what does local missions look like, kind of from a lifestyle perspective for you? What are you currently doing?
So like you said, wherever we go, we are like ambassadors for Christ. And so right now, I am living in an apartment complex that is mostly Hindu. And most of them are Indians or Pakistani, mostly from India. And so sort of just building community with my neighbors. And yeah. I think that's sort of one of the reasons why I was drawn to India just in general is just because you've seen, that was where Hinduism started, Buddhism started, and like Islam has a strong presence there, and so the Lord has always put on my heart a desire to reach people that are in India, because
10% of the world's Muslims live in India, but only 1 in 10 Indians are Muslim.
Interesting.
So 10% of their country equals 10% of the global population of one major religion. So that speaks to their diversity, but also the scale of whatever happens in India is happening big.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Angela, thank you so much for making time for the interview. This has been a work in progress for a while, and we've had a lot of conversations, so I think this adds a valuable element to this topic of mobilizing everyone, the gospel from everywhere to everywhere. So that's what we're about. So thank you.
You're welcome. Good to be here.